Welcome to another episode of On Production, presented by Rapbook. Our guest today is a powerhouse in the entertainment industry, Mark Litwak. Mark is an esteemed entertainment attorney, a producer's representative, author, educator, and expert witness. His law firm, based in Los Angeles, deals with copyright, trademark, and multimedia law, among other fields. He's been involved in over 200 feature films, numerous TV and new media series, and he's an adjunct professor at the USC Gould School of Law. We're going to explore the legal landscapes of the entertainment industry, as well as Mark's unique journey from law to showbiz. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Cameron.
The first thing I'd love to know, Mark, is how did you transition from studying law to specializing in entertainment law?
It's not a path that I would necessarily recommend to anyone, and it wasn't really intentional. But I grew up in New York, and I went to college and graduate school in New York, and then I went to law school in San Diego, at the University of San Diego. And they didn't offer it, and I didn't take any entertainment law classes in law school. But then after graduation, I had been working as an assistant in the district attorney's office. And then after graduation, I moved back to New York and landed in Albany, New York, where I ran a public interest organization called NYPIRG out of Albany. And I was a regional director for that organization for about 3 years. And then I got offered the opportunity to write a book about the movie industry. So I moved to LA, and I spent about 3 years writing a book for William Morrow about movie industry called Real Power. And essentially that was my education in the film business because I didn't really study film or the movie business in college or graduate school or law school. So I wrote the book, and then I became a television producer for a company called Marble Arch. And I became a news journalist for a show called Newscope, which did syndicated news things. And then I became a law professor at the University of West Los Angeles, and I started building up a private practice on my own on the side. And since then, I've taught for about 20 years at UCLA. I'm currently, I think I've been teaching at USC Law School for the past 8 years, and I've taught at Loyola and a couple other places as well. So it's a long and convoluted route that wasn't really planned.
That sounds like it matches many people's kind of career paths into the entertainment industry. I know certainly it aligns with my own kind of experience getting into entertainment payroll and entertainment technology. Super interesting that the book and thinking about and researching and then writing about the industry kind of was the path that ultimately had this massive impact on your career and ultimately a lot of people's productions over the years as well. I'm curious, when it comes to the type of law that you practice on behalf of producers, can you elaborate on your role, both as a producer yourself and then as a producer's representative, of how that integrates with your legal expertise?
Well, when you're a lawyer, you're asked to give advice, but you're not giving advice in a vacuum. Frankly, I don't think an entertainment law, a lawyer who doesn't understand the movie business and the dynamics and how it works is necessarily going to give very good advice. So you have to understand the industry you're working in, because the advice is not always strictly legal advice. It's often strategic advice of, how do I accomplish this? How do I do this? And a lot of that is not taught in law school. In fact, a lot of it isn't taught in film school at all. I mean, how do I get an agent? How do I submit my project? How do I arrange financing? None of that, as far as I can tell, is taught in either law school or film school, and people sort of have to learn it through the school of hard knocks. I think it's a very, very difficult industry for many people to break into, for most people to break into, because, there aren't well-defined steps to take to succeed. If you just want to be a lawyer, it's pretty clear what your path is. You have to go to law school, although in California you could conceivably become a lawyer without going to law school. You got to go to law school, you got to pass the bar, then you got to get yourself an entry-level position. And over time, even if you're not the most brilliant lawyer, you tend to rise and succeed, and it's the same thing with a doctor and a lot of other professions. There's sort of a clear path forward. You sort of know where you're going. But in the movie industry, it's the Wild West. There are people who are very well educated and just completely strike out, and there's other people who make something that catches the public fancy, and they go from a nobody to a superstar overnight. So things change a great deal, and one of the reasons is that in the movie business, essentially what you're selling is creativity. You're selling a story. You're selling a movie. And for example, let me give you a comparison between movies and soap. Okay, I like Ivory soap. It's plain white soap. I've been using it, I don't know, 40 years. And when I hop in the shower and open up a new bar of soap, I have very modest expectations for that soap. As long as it does the same thing it's done for the past 40 years, I'm okay with it, and I'll continue to buy it. But when I go to the movies, I have a completely different mental framework. If I go to a movie and it's very derivative and it's just like another movie I've seen, I'm very disappointed. When I go to the movies, I always want to see something fresh and original and different. And because basically the commodity the movie business is selling is creativity. And the problem is that it's a very creative product, and audiences often want what's new, what they don't necessarily, they can't necessarily tell you ahead of time what they want. I mean, for instance, George Lucas had a hell of a time getting the first Star Wars made. Even though he had made American Graffiti and it was a success, he brought it to every studio in town. They all rejected it. They all gave him the conventional wisdom: science fiction doesn't sell. That was a very common conventional understanding of the movie business. Finally, he convinces Alan Ladd at 20th Century Fox to fund the first movie, and it's a huge hit. And every studio in town ever since has been developing science fiction stories like crazy. And the same thing happened again and again and again. And so, a lot of the executives in the movie business, they're driving down the highway at 90 miles an hour with their eyes firmly on the rearview mirror. They're looking at what happened in the past and what was successful in the past for how to steer going forward. And that's crazy because people don't want to see the same movie that they saw. They want to see something fresh and new and original. And when a filmmaker is able to make that and get it out there, get it distributed, often it gets a very good reaction and it changes the rules of the game.
That's fantastic. I'm actually reading Neil Gabler's Walt Disney biography right now. What a fantastic author and historian of our industry. And, it's interesting. Everything that Disney is because of leadership focused squarely on the future, just like what you're saying. Fresh, new, original, always pushing, always demanding that the work be better than the work before.
Right.
And that's fantastic.
But the problem is that the movie industry is run by executives who are not that creative, to be honest. They may be creative with budgets and accounting and stuff like that, but most of the people who are running the executive suites at the major studios, they're not filmmakers who graduated to the executive suites. They're people, a lot of them are like former agents or managers that become studio executives. They're there because of their relationships that they have and people they can bring in. But they're not movie makers. And in fact, it's been said that Steven Spielberg has been offered the ability to run a studio, and he said, no, thanks. I'd rather make movies. It's much more fun than sitting in committee meetings all day and determining, how to run the studio. I'd rather go out and make movies.
I guess that's why these filmmakers have guys like you and I, right? I handle the payroll. You handle some of the stuff in the law. I'm really curious, Mark, what are some of the common issues that filmmakers do come to you for when arranging financing, marketing, distribution? Like, what are the kind of common themes or kind of the baseline that you start out with all new clients as they kind of come to work with you and have you represent them and their interests?
Well, we have a wide variety of different clients, so it's kind of hard to generalize. But I would say a big chunk of my practice is doing what's called production legal work. And that is all the contracts necessary to make a movie and secure the rights so that you can get distribution. And that means, having written agreements to acquire the script, having written agreements to employ your actors. Literally hundreds of different contracts and agreements have to be negotiated in order to make a movie that can then hopefully is good, but then can be sellable. And one of the problems that I often encounter is filmmakers, they don't secure the rights. They make handshake deals. They collaborate with people with nothing in writing. And they end up sometimes making something good, but it can't be distributed because we can't do the paperwork. I've had clients who have made entire movies without a production lawyer and paid people. And when I say, well, where are the agreements with the actors? They say, well, I can show you my receipts, my canceled checks. I say, no, that's not good enough. Copyright law has very specific requirements. If you are a producer and you want to own your film, you have to have written work for hire agreements with your cast and crew, vesting their work product, the copyright in you, or you have to license material like music or pre-existing copyrighted work to incorporate it. And if you make a really good movie, but you don't have your paperwork in order, you could probably distribute it on YouTube and get away with it. But you're not gonna get any major studio, any significant player to take on your film. They want to distribute your film. They don't want to open themselves up to a lawsuit. And one of the biggest problems is, filmmakers, they tend to be creative people. They often have ideas, and they're not often, very business oriented. That's not always the case. There are some people who do both. And sometimes you have a director and an artistic person who teams up with a producer who's more business oriented. But if you don't secure the rights, you're going to have a problem. And this happens all the time. Sometimes you can fix it retroactively, but I've had clients who make movies and everyone disperses and they go into post and 6 months later the film is done. They don't have contracts. And now we have to find a guy who had a key role in it. And, he only works 5 days a year. The rest of the time he's waiting tables or driving a taxi. And they can't find him. They can't find him to have him, sign a piece of paper. And so it becomes a real problem.
That's super fascinating. And something that we talk a lot about is errors and omissions, insurance. But, how do you keep from ever having to have a claim to begin with? Great contracts, good shared understanding between filmmakers and producers and actors about what it is that people are entering into in terms of agreements. It makes tremendous amount of sense. On this point, you brought up, copyright. I'm curious, what are some key aspects of copyright and trademark law that every filmmaker, whether they're just starting out or are seasoned and grizzled, should understand?
Well, copyright and trademark are two different things, and a lot of people who are not intellectual property lawyers don't understand the difference. A trademark is essentially a brand, like Nike for sneakers or Pepsi-Cola for soda. And you can put a name on your product without registering it with the Patent and Trademark Office. But if you do register it, you get some super duper extra rights. Basically, you can prevent someone from using the same or very similar trademark on a similar product or service. So if you set up a hamburger stand and you call yourself McDonald's, and you have a trademark in McDonald's, you can stop someone from across the street setting up a competing fast food restaurant called McDonald's because it will cause confusion to consumers. It doesn't necessarily, however, stop you from setting up the McDonald's hardware store across the street because hardware and fast food, they're different businesses, and you don't go into the hardware store and say, give me a Big Mac and cheese and, some French fries. And you don't go into McDonald's and say, I need a bunch of bolts, So they're not competitive businesses. So trademarks can be limited to the geographical area. A company like McDonald's is worldwide, so it's almost everywhere. But sometimes you have a trademark in a company or a product it's just in one region. It's not necessarily infringing a trademark of a very similar product in another region because they're not competitive. Okay, so that's trademark law. And one thing that filmmakers should know is that you can only infringe a trademark if you're using the trademark to sell a product. If you're shooting the scene and in the background a FedEx truck enters the screen inadvertently, not planned, and you get the FedEx, logo in your thing, you don't necessarily have to get permission from FedEx. Now, the major studios tend to try to get permission for everything. But independent filmmakers, won't bother, or shouldn't have to bother, because even though the FedEx image is in your frame, you're not using it as a trademark. It's different than if you make a film, and at the beginning of the film you say, FedEx presents Now you're using the FedEx trademark as a trademark, okay? But if it's just in passing, in the background, you don't necessarily need a release. So that's one thing. Now, copyright is entirely different in trademark. Copyright is a property right, and it's derived from the United States Constitution, which empowers Congress to protect the works of authors. And authors is very broadly defined. Authors doesn't just mean people who write books. Authors means musicians, painters, all people who create creative work, okay? And if you create something that's copyrightable, you automatically, instantaneously get the copyright in your work without filling out any forms, without writing any checks, without engaging in any rituals. If you write a poem, you own the copyright in that poem. If you choose, and it's optional, to register your copyright with the Copyright Office, then you get some extra super duper benefits. And it's in the case of someone infringing your copyright, those benefits make all the difference in the world, because they're going to entitle you to statutory damages and reimbursement of attorney fees. So if you're writing the script, if you're a script writer, you should, at some point, before you start circulating the script in the industry, you should register it with the Copyright Office. You can now do it online. It's different than registering it with the Writers Guild. The Writers Guild is a union of writers. It's not a part of the federal government. The Copyright Office is. The Writers Guild can't give you the same benefits you can get from registering a copyright. And if you register your script with the Copyright Office, it's kind of superfluous to also register with the Writers Guild. You don't need to do that. Okay? So if you register it, then you'll be able to protect yourself from any kind of theft of your script. And, that should be, it's not very expensive. And you don't even need a lawyer necessarily, to register it. You can fill out the forms online and register your work, and that will protect you. So American copyright law is territorial. What that means is that every country in the world has their own copyright law. And in France, they go by French copyright law. And in the United States, we go by American copyright law. And French copyright law and American copyright law are quite different. In America, we have something called the work for hire doctrine, which says that the employer can be the owner, the original author of a work. So if Microsoft hires someone to do coding for them, and they enter into a work for hire agreement, or they're an employee of Microsoft, anything they create with the scope of their employment is owned by Microsoft. Copyright is owned by not by them. Now, if they're coding all day and working for Microsoft, and Microsoft owns the code that they create, that doesn't mean that in the evenings when they go together and go jamming on their guitar with their friends, that Microsoft owns their music. It doesn't, obviously. That's not within the scope. They're not being hired by Microsoft to make music. They're being hired to code, create code. So we have some doctrines in the United States that are different, like the work for hire doctrine in a lot of other countries. And so every country in the world enforces their own copyright law. And in France, they have a copyright law that in many ways is much more protective of artists than the United States. Okay, so there's a famous case where John Huston, he directed a movie called The Asphalt Jungle, and he purposely shot it in black and white. He could have shot it in color. He shot it in black and white because that's the way he wanted it to be. And under French copyright law, he's considered the auteur, and he has certain rights in that movie that are not recognized under American law for films. Okay, so he makes the movie, and it's distributed, and it ends up, I think it ends up in the MGM library. And at some point, Ted Turner buys that library, and he decides he's going to colorize all these old black and white films and make them color films, and arguably maybe make them more commercial, because some people would prefer to watch colored films. And anyway, so John Huston, who was an employee and directed this movie, and as an employee, it was a work for hire. It was owned by the studio. It was not owned by him. And after he dies, Ted Turner sells the colorized version of The Asphalt Jungle in France. And John Huston's heirs bring suit in Paris just to get an injunction to stop distribution in France, because John Huston, his moral rights, say that you can't change an artist's work without their permission. and it was changed. And so the Asphalt Jungle, the colorized version, could not be distributed in France. While it could be distributed in the United States, it's considered the studio's copyright, not his. We don't recognize mobile rights in the United States, except for fine art in the United States.
That is so fascinating. Mark, something that we discussed just a little while ago is that in your practice, like a lot of the work is about making sure that films are set up in such a way as to not run into litigious outcomes. But you've also served as an expert witness or have been a student of many of these landmark cases that have had a significant impact on what the film industry is or will become. I'm curious, can you discuss some of the landmark cases that you've served as an expert witness on, or what the types of cases look like when they do unfortunately become litigious?
I'm not sure. I've been an expert witness on maybe about 20 different cases. And often I'm not sure I would consider any of them landmark cases. There's thousands of cases, this country is a little bit litigation crazy. And
Sure
my
is.
job as a lawyer for filmmakers is to keep them out of court, because I can
Right.
assure you the only people who often benefit from going to court are the lawyers. They make very good fees, and it's not a pleasant experience necessarily for the parties. So I try to protect them from, keep them out of court and keep them away from disputes, because most filmmakers, they don't want to be in these disputes. They want to be off making the next film. Anyway, as an expert witness, I'm often hired by other lawyers to testify about customs and practices in the business. I've been hired in a couple of cases where there were divorces, and part of the assets of the marriage were films, or film rights in films. And I was asked to, give an assessment of, what they're worth, which can be difficult to, evaluate something like a film and what it's worth. It can change over time. A lot of films were thought to be somewhat worthless, and then all of a sudden someone invented VHS and DVD, devices, and all of a sudden they got a new life. And they got another new life when streaming came about, so it can be difficult. But anyway, so in those cases, I'm hired as a witness to appear in court and depositions or in arbitrations, and to, basically just, give my opinion. And the truth is that most judges don't know a great deal about the movie business, and often you need to bring in someone who can educate them as to how things work. I had one case where I was retained by the Attorney General of Texas. The state of Texas was in a dispute with AMC Theaters, one of the largest theater chains in the country. And AMC Theaters was claiming a certain tax write-off, and they were claiming that showing movies in theaters was a product, not a service. And so I was asked to come in and give an opinion upon that. And that's what happened. And believe it or not, the Texas Attorney General lost the trial, but it was overturned on appeal.
Unbelievable. It's interesting. You said at the top of our interview that, you're currently a professor at USC, but you've been at UCLA, a number of other fantastic universities in the California area. Can you tell us about the courses you teach and what are some of the key takeaways for students?
Well, for the past, I think, about 7-8 years, I've been on the adjunct faculty, mainly part-time faculty at USC Law School. And my first couple of years there, I taught JD students, or students who are getting a Juris Doctorate degree. It's what most lawyers have. And most of the students are a year or two out of college, and they're pretty young, and they're going to go to law school, and then they're going to graduate. Maybe when they're 26 or 27 or something like that, they'll become lawyers. But more recently at USC, I've been teaching in a graduate program where they offer an LLM degree. And the LLM degree is sort of an advanced degree, and all my students are lawyers. But 98% of them are lawyers from outside the United States. So they come to USC for this one-year program to get this advanced degree. And then I expect most of them go back to their countries. And now they have their local law degree, and they also have an American law degree. And that's probably makes them more attractive as a lawyer in their country. So a lot of my students have been from Japan, South Korea, China, Europe, and many of them, English is not their first language. and they have to not only, have a local law degree, but they also have to pass a English proficiency test because the classes are in English, because I don't speak Chinese. And I have to say, I find it pretty remarkable, the ability. I mean, I can just imagine myself going to China and taking a graduate class in law. I mean, how difficult that would be for me. A different language, different customs, totally different system. So I have a lot of respect for them doing that. The LLM students tend to be a little bit older because they're already lawyers, so they tend to be maybe in their 30s, young 30s or whatever.
That's excellent. Have you ever taught a course on entertainment law specifically? It sounds like, you're teaching American contract law, tort.
No, I'm only teaching entertainment law.
Oh, you're only teaching them entertainment law.
At one point, a long time ago, many, many years ago, I taught torts and workers' comp and some other things. But, for the past 20 years or so, I only teach entertainment law. That's all I teach.
That's fantastic. What are the key takeaways for those students related to kind of your courses related to entertainment?
The United States, we don't dominate very many industries anymore. I mean, we probably still want to dominate makers of aircraft, with Boeing. But one industry we really do dominate is the movie industry. I mean, American movies are not only seen and enjoyed in the United States, but they're very attractive to audiences worldwide, far more so than Americans being curious about watching foreign films. Although I think that's changing now with Netflix. Finally, we have access to some foreign films, and some of them are really great. But the American movie industry sort of really dominates all of the countries. Now, that doesn't mean all the movies are made here. They're often shot everywhere. But many of them are essentially financed by one of the major studios and use people from the major studios. And they tend to, be some of the most successful movies out there. And so I think a lot of these students, their industries are not necessarily as developed as ours. In China, they've been producing their own movies. When they started expanding the number of theaters, and they have more theaters in China than the United States by far. Initially, the marketplace was dominated with American films. And a lot of countries outside the United States engage in a lot of co-productions where, for instance, like Canada has, I think, about 65 co-production treaties with other countries in the world, allowing Canadian filmmakers and sometimes even American filmmakers to get various benefits from shooting in Canada or using some Canadian actors or directors or writers. So I think that in many countries in the world, they want to learn about the American movie industry and how it works because it affects them. Because the American major studios often have subsidiaries in other countries, and our films are often the most popular and most widely circulated and distributed.
That is awesome. Awesome, Mark. I mean, what inspired you to take up teaching, and how does it complement your work as an attorney?
I don't know. I mean, my mother was a school teacher, and I've always enjoyed teaching. But I mean, except for 7 years when I was a full professor, I've mostly just been an adjunct, teaching part-time, just, maybe a class or two a year. So it's not like it takes up most of my time, but I find it rewarding and interesting, and I'd like to deal with the students. And during COVID, I had to teach on Zoom, which was an interesting experience. And in some ways, it was, my classes recently at USC have been 80 students, and I can't possibly remember their names with 80 students, especially when a lot of them are foreign names that I can barely pronounce. But when I'm teaching them on Zoom, their name is right on the bottom of the screen. So in some ways it's easier for me to call on them.
It's much nicer.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I can remember their names, because it's right there on the screen. And otherwise I would have difficulty. And also I found that on Zoom, some of the students are a little bit less shy than speaking up in a classroom with a big lecture hall with 80 students. Some of them are a little bit shy, but on Zoom, some of them, since they're sitting in their bathroom in their apartment, they're less shy, they're more comfortable, and they participate more. So it was interesting.
That's great. I mean, just being a part of that type of, pedagogical experience, like keeps you sharp, keeps you up to date with things that are interesting and happening that, your students will be interested in digging into. And it's a great way to give back and kind of proliferate good thinking in entertainment law. So that's awesome. Mark, you've been a producer, practicing attorney, a teacher of entertainment law, and you've actually written a number of books and publications. Can you talk us through some of the books you've authored and maybe discuss, how these books have been helpful to you in your own understanding of the industry and how the books have been received by kind of the industry broadly?
Written 6 books, hundreds of articles. But the first book I wrote was called Real Power, The Struggle for Influence and Success in the Movie Business. It came out in 1986. It was my first book about the movie industry, and it's about why some films get made and others don't, why some people succeed and others don't. It had a fair amount of success. It was initially published in hardcover by William Morrow, and then in softcover. It's had 2 publishers in softcover. It's still, I believe it's still in print with Silman James Press. And then my second book was the one book that's not movie related. It's called Courtroom Crusaders. It was also done for William Morrow in hardcover. And it's a bunch of, it's an anthology of stories about maverick lawyers, basically. And so I went and interviewed a lawyer up in Alaska who was an environmentalist and criminal defense lawyer in Minnesota, and a whole bunch of lawyers doing non-traditional things with their law degree. And so that came out around 1990 or 91 or so. And then I wrote a book called Deal Making in the Film and Television Business, which I think is perhaps my most successful book. It's already on the 4th edition, and it's won some awards. And basically, it's a primer on entertainment law and copyright and trademark and all the things. And it's written so that non-lawyers can read it, understand it. And that's been very popular. And in fact, for my classes at USC, I use it as the course book. That's what they're using. And then I wrote a book on multimedia law. It's a little bit outdated now, and it's out of print. And I wrote a book called Risky Business about independent filmmaking. I don't know, is that 6, something like that?
With Risky Business, financing and distributing film and independent film, what are kind of the big key takeaways or lessons that you're hoping your readers take away from when picking up that book and really digesting it?
It is a risky business going into the film business, and it's very frustrating for a lot of aspiring filmmakers to break in. And I think a lot of them don't understand the dynamics of how Hollywood works, which is covered maybe more in Real Power than even a Risky Business. But when you're starting out in the business, it's very hard to get any access whatsoever. I mean, if you write a script, you can't just call up Warner Brothers and say, hey, I'd like to come in and discuss it with you. They won't even talk to you. They won't even take a meeting. They probably won't return your phone call. And if you send them a script unsolicited, they'll return it to you. And the same thing about getting an agent. It's very hard to get your start. I interviewed Jim Abrahams and the Zucker brothers for my first book, Real Power. And they said they tried for years to break into the movie business. And, they made Kentucky Fried Movie and Airplane. And they said, we were knocking on doors and no one wanted to meet with us. And then we had one hit and everyone in town wanted to meet with us. And they were like throwing money at us and throwing projects at us. It wasn't that from one day to the next they became talented. They were talented all along. But once you achieve a certain level of success in the movie business, things become much, much easier. If you're a star, you don't have to worry about, finding roles. They're coming to you. Your agent's job is to read the 100 scripts a year sent to you and decide which ones you want to do, because you can only do probably 2 or 3. If you're a director, the same thing. So getting to the point of having some success is what the real challenge is. And increasingly, I think the best way to go is simply to go out and make your own movie and stop waiting for permission from the powers that be to bless you and give you money, because most of the time they're not going to do it. Most of the time, you're going to get your start when your friends and family give you a small amount of money and you go out and make a movie. And if it's really good, it'll take off. And then people will want to meet with you. Okay. So, I mean, there are people making movies nowadays on their iPhones. The technology has changed so much. It has made the movie industry much more democratic than it used to be. It used to be, if you wanted to make a feature film, you needed to raise a minimum of a few $100,000 just to pay for the negative stock and the developing. Now, you can get a very good, adequate digital camera for $5,000 or less. And, if you shoot a scene, it doesn't work, you just hit rewind, you go back and you shoot it again, and you can now edit on a Macintosh computer. You can edit your film. You can shoot it on a digital camera. And, there's some amazing movies being made for very little money. So money is not the barrier. I mean, for people with very limited resources, it's still a barrier, but it's much less of a barrier than it used to be. And sometimes, you have to realize that you need to take your career into your own hands. You need to go out there and make your movie. And if it's good, I think all kinds of great things are going to happen as a result. But if you're constantly waiting for other people, to give you their blessing, it may be a pretty long way.
I think that's a extremely wise piece of advice for anybody in any industry, which is, your life is your own and you've got to stand up and go make something of it.
And, if you make a good film, there's all these film festivals that can serve as a launching pad for you, get it seen and get it before people. And the truth is that that major studio executives do not have a monopoly on wisdom about what movies are going to work and what ones not. In fact, their batting record is extremely poor. I mean, if you look at all the movies that are released in the United States every year, there's really only about 3 dozen, that get to the, blockbuster $100 million stage. The vast majority of movies don't do much business. And a lot of them, major studios will often put out 15, 18, 20 movies a year. 3 or 4 of them are making almost all the money, and the rest of them are not working. And the major studios, they have plenty of money. They have access to the top talent, the top stars, the top directors. And yet most of the time they get up to bat and the movie just doesn't work, because it's very hard to know which stories are going to resonate with audiences. I remember that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. It was made and all the studios, said, oh, no, there just aren't that many Greek Americans. People aren't going to get it. They all passed on it. Gold Circle Films took it out itself, and it became a blockbuster hit. It did, $200, $300 million in business, because, it was about a Greek family, but so what? I mean, people who are Italian or Jewish, they say, hey, that's just like my family, got the crazy grandmother, and we got, got the same sort of dynamics, and they could relate to it. And it became a huge hit. And there were lines around the block of people wanting to buy tickets to see that movie. And at the same time, in other theaters, major studio films costing 100 times as much were showing to mostly empty theaters. So it doesn't matter. If you have a really good story, that's what makes the difference, because that's what people care about. And it's what
Absolutely.
It's what your friends tell you at the water cooler on Monday about what they saw last weekend that has far more impact than any advertising the major studios can do to try to get you to go see their movies.
Absolutely. I'm smiling thinking about that movie because it really just warms your heart to watch it, because the themes and the stories are universal, and it still resonates to this day. I mean, there's so many examples like this in the film world, and they usually come out of the indie world, which is great. I think it's a wonderful ecosystem of filmmakers and storytellers. And, you mentioned earlier, camera technology is so much cheaper, but even there's been a revolution in lighting with LEDs. I mean, really the opportunity for storytellers to contribute to the marketplace of ideas has never been easier. And film and cinema has always been an incredible distribution platform for people to kind of share intellectual ideas, emotional ideas, the whole landscape of human existence. And so that's really awesome. Mark, as we've been kind of going through your career, your background, your practice areas, it's awesome, the contributions you've made to the entertainment industry. I'm curious if there are any memorable awards or cases or projects that you've been particularly proud of the outcome.
Well, the first edition of a deal making won an award called the Krasner-Krauss Award, and they brought me and my family over to London, and London, the British Film Commissioner, gave the award is for the best book on the movie business. That was that deal-making book, the first edition. It's now in the 4th edition. First edition was pretty slender. Now that was pretty thick. I have that, and I've been voted by my peers. Martindale Hubbell does anonymous peer reviews of other lawyers, and I've gotten the highest rating for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I've also been the same thing with super lawyers. They poll other lawyers, and so I've been designated a super lawyer, I think now 14 or 15 times or whatever. So those are the major awards. And as far as court cases go, most of the time, a lot of the time, it's me representing a filmmaker who's been cheated by a distributor and trying to get them their money back or get them what they're owed. And so let me just say, for filmmakers, when it comes, if you make a film and distributors want it, just don't sign the piece of paper put in front of you. Get someone who knows something to review it, because it's negotiable. And I'm just amazed sometimes at some of the very sad stories of talented filmmakers who make a great film, and then they get completely exploited by some of these rather sleazy distributors who take advantage of them. And, if you make a good film and it makes us money back, you pay back your investors, you can make another film. But if you make a good film and you get exploited and you don't get any money back, that may be the end of your career. And we're losing a lot of good people, because a lot of good filmmakers we're losing because they're being exploited by some very unethical sales agents and distributors.
So on those cases where you mend those wrongs, I would imagine there's a particular sense of pride in that, which is fantastic. Are there any movies that you've had a hand in, or projects you've had a hand in, that you've been excited about in terms of their impact on culture?
Well, I'm not sure any of my movies have changed the culture. As far as I'm concerned, the culture to some extent is going downhill. So I'm not sure I want to take credit for it. I mean, if you look at movies overall, frankly, I think a lot of the movies, I like foreign films. I like documentaries. I like quirky independent films. A lot of what the major studios are putting out are just another superhero movie. And I can tell you in the first 5 minutes of the movie exactly what's going to happen. They're all sort of out of the same cookie cutter. And so I have to say that a lot of the major studio fare has become increasingly homogenized. It's almost like there's a formula. You got the superhero and you got the villain, and, they come up against these obstacles and then they win. And it's like the same story told again and again and again. And frankly, I don't find most of these blockbuster hits all that interesting. They're all very derivative. What I like is something that I watch it and I say, wow, that's unusual. Who would have ever thought,
Do you make the rounds at film festivals pretty regularly, Mark, or not so much?
I used to do a lot more of that. I used to go to Cannes and Toronto and a lot of other film festivals. Not so much anymore. But it's great to go to film festivals, and sometimes you see some, really interesting, unusual films that are unexpected. So we do go to some.
That's great. You had mentioned something just a moment ago about kind of challenges and pitfalls that producers can oftentimes run into, especially if they're just starting out. And you said oftentimes it's signing a contract before reviewing it. What are some of the common legal mistakes that filmmakers or producers make?
Well, one mistake is incorporating in your film photos or material that you don't have the rights to. Like taking some people seem to think if it's on the internet, it's fair game, and you can just take it and put it in your movie. And sometimes you can under the fair use doctrine, but sometimes you can't. And, so you have to be careful about that. Filmmakers should also always have their script cleared before they go into production. If you have a legal problem in your script, often it can be changed very inexpensively just by changing some dialogue or changing a scene before you shoot. But if you shoot the film and then a lawyer looks at it and says, "Oh, you got a problem here," you may have to go and reshoot materials, and it can be very expensive. So it's very important, I think, to get the script clear, before you go into production. Another thing that's important is to have a set photographer. The biggest complaint of I hear from distributors is there aren't enough still photos, and no, it's not good enough to take them off the film itself. You need a still photographer there, at least a fair portion of the time. Take some good stills of the actors and also some behind the scenes stuff, and they're going to be needed for the press kit. You should have at least 100 good still photos. When you license a film to a distributor, they don't want just the film. They need other collateral material to help market it. They need good key art. They need a good trailer. They need good stills. They need a good synopsis. There's a whole bunch of other things that go along with it. If you have a film that's kind of a mediocre film, but you get a really good trailer, you'll make some sales. Whereas if you have a really good film, but you have a pretty mediocre trailer, it's going to be much more difficult. I think, one of the problems I see is a lot of filmmakers, probably out of financial necessity, they don't have a production lawyer, and they just use contracts of some other shoot. And their production manager says, "Oh, well, we use these contracts on this other shoot. Why don't you use them?" And the filmmaker thinks, "Well, that's great, but not all contracts are the same. There's not just one set of contracts. They vary. I mean, there's some contracts for actors. There are some that are direct employment, and there's some are loan outs. There are some that are union. There are some that are non-union. There's variations, and someone has to make sure you're using the right contract, and so you don't have to later on go and fix everything or try to fix everything."
Some fantastic advice. Mark, with your finger on the pulse of both law and entertainment, and with the world changing as quickly as it has been, both in terms of technology of how films are made, technology and how films are distributed and produced, I'm curious just what trends are you seeing and changes that you foresee both in the legal landscape of the industry and just the industry at large?
Well, the legal industry is actually relatively small. I mean, entertainment lawyers, they're mostly in New York or LA. If they're in the music business, maybe in Nashville. If they're in the multimedia, video game business, maybe San Francisco. But you don't find many full-time entertainment lawyers outside of those areas. It's a relatively small community, and by and large, you negotiate with the same people again and again and again. You better keep your word, and because you may take advantage of someone today, but next week, the tables are going to be turned on you. And if you didn't act honorably, it's going to cost you. So the industry is relatively small compared to, for instance, like the banking industry or the oil and gas industry. I mean, it's relatively small. The biggest change that's been going on recently, and there's been a lot of changes in the movie business. The movie business was changed dramatically by the rise of television in the 1950s. Movie going dropped off dramatically because people realized you could buy this appliance and sit at home and watch all the stuff you want for free. Then changed again with home video, VHS and DVDs. And now more recently, things have changed a great deal with streaming. And that has really drastically changed the economics of the business. That's what concerns me right now, that in the strike. I used to have cable TV, and I was paying over $300 a month for cable TV. Then I got rid of it and started subscribing to over-the-top, streaming channels, and now I pay about $50 a month. I'm not lacking anything. I'm seeing as much, if not more, than before. And that's going on in the industry. Cable TV is dying, and streaming platforms are increasing, but the amount of money that's being generated is going down. And so now you have all these companies who are following Netflix's lead and getting into streaming, but the amount of money that's coming back from people watching films is also declining. And so we're in a kind of a difficult time. The writers and the actors are justifiably concerned about the decrease in their revenue, especially from things like residuals. They need to be able to earn a living to stay in the business. If you lose all these writers and actors and people, you're not going to have the pool of manpower you need to make good movies. So we'll see what happens. We'll see. Hopefully the strike will be settled within the next month or so.
Yeah, fingers crossed for everybody's sake. For you, Mark, what are you most excited about in your upcoming projects or endeavors?
Well, actually, the project that I'm most excited about is my son, who's a filmmaker, who went to NYU Film School. He just finished his first feature called Molly and Max in the Future. It premiered at South by Southwest. It's been in a bunch of other festivals and won a bunch of awards. And it's coming out in February around Valentine's Day. And it's a sci-fi romantic comedy. That's the movie I'm most excited about.
That is fantastic. How fun. That's fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for your time. I'm curious before we conclude here, when you're not writing, teaching, or practicing law, what are some of your personal interests?
Well, I like to go to the movies. I like to play tennis. I read a lot. No skydiving or anything particularly unusual.
That's great. Any final words of advice for aspiring filmmakers or lawyers or soon-to-be lawyers thinking about getting into the entertainment segment?
Well, what I would say is, don't be disappointed if you're not an overnight success, because frankly, whenever you look into the background of people who are claimed to be or thought of as overnight success, often you realize that they've worked for 10 years and then they become an overnight success. I don't see too many real overnight successes. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, and if you stick to it, eventually, hopefully, you can earn a living in this business. But you shouldn't expect it to happen, 1, 2, 3. It rarely happens that way.
Tenacity, grit, and making it happen.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yes, that's what you need.
Well, Mark, thanks for being on production. Really appreciate your time and your expertise.
You're welcome. Thank you.